after decades of behaving like a beaten dog with the Republican Party that promises its voters things and never ever delivers on them when they actually have power. This is just incredible. These EOs have been, like I said, just a wish list of serious conservative policy. This is the most prepared, competent, and ruthless right-wing administration in, I think the last 100 years.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Inez Stepman. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show, where now you can join the community, ask me questions, and I will be bringing not just a paywalled episode every week, but also answers to your questions. So make sure to subscribe there to join the Undercurrents community. Now, President Trump induced a very predictable panic across the country on Monday night by announcing a freeze of hundreds of billions of dollars in federal grants and loans. The move came actually in the form of a letter from Trump's Office of Management and Budget, and local officials, charities, all of these kinds of groups around the country spent much of the day yesterday, trying to figure out what the heck that memo actually meant. The Wall Street Journal reported, quote, states and local governments scrambled Tuesday to assess the impact of a broad and far-reaching order by the White House to pause hundreds of billions of dollars in federal grants, loans, and other financial assistance programs, pending review by the Trump administration. The Journal added, the memo's broad language prompted some federal officials to wonder whether it halted the vast array of federal assistance programs, from Medicaid and nutrition programs for school children to rental assistance and highway funding. Footnotes to the memo exempted Medicare, Social Security benefits, and assistance provided directly to individuals, but gave few other clues as to what it covered or didn't cover. People were literally reading the footnotes to figure out if Medicare was included in this, and questions were then immediately raised about Medicaid. Washington Post reporter Jeff Stein talked to a nonprofit that was working with homeless veterans in California that said a freeze would jeopardize their programs, as many, many similar nonprofits funded by federal grants worry throughout the day. I actually saw this in just announcements by charities all over the country. The White House released a midday memo clarifying that the first memo was, quote, expressly limited to programs, projects, and activities implicated by the president's executive orders, such as ending DEI, the Green New Deal, and funding non-governmental organizations that undermine the national interest, and, quote, any program that provides direct benefits to Americans is explicitly excluded from the pause and exempted from this review process. In addition to Social Security and Medicare, already explicitly included in the guidance, mandatory programs like Medicaid and SNAP, that's food stamps, will continue without pause. So there was a lot to figure out here. The White House is arguing now that the freeze was necessary to ensure taxpayer money is not being spent on DEI or on programs that cut against the duly elected president's agenda. He is, after all, the head of the executive branch. So here's how White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, at yesterday's first White House press briefing, talked about the measure.
Is the Trump administration recommending that organizations that rely on federal funding make payroll, pay their rent in the meantime?
It is a temporary pause, and the Office of Management and Budget is reviewing the federal funding that has been going out the door. Again, not for individual assistance, but for all of these other programs that I mentioned. I also spoke with the incoming director of OMB this morning, and he told me to tell all of you that the line to his office is open for other federal government agencies across the board, and if they feel that programs are necessary and in line with the president's agenda, then the Office of Management and Budget will review those policies. I think this is a very responsible measure. Again, the past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country, and it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for honestly.
Trump, armed with policies designed after his 2020 loss, is still on a days-long spree of executive activity. If you go on the White House website, there are dozens and dozens of decisions listed under, quote, presidential actions. Some journalists obviously noted that many of these policies seem to have been lifted from Project 2025, and as we covered here months ago on this show, that was always inevitable. Trump genuinely had nothing to do with the Heritage Foundation's plan, but he'd have no choice if he were elected but to hire people that were involved with the effort And again, conservatives spent years carefully crafting these plans basically in lab conditions, whether they would go to the desk of Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump. So, of course, a Republican president was going to use a lot of it. Here's how Politico Playbook put this on Tuesday morning. Quote, "Let's be clear, what we are witnessing is nothing short of a revolution inside the U.S. government, with unknown numbers of civil servants either being removed from their jobs or effectively facing some kind of loyalty test if they wish to stay on. But let's also be clear," Playbook, which is a widely read newsletter here in D.C., continued, "amidst the liberal outrage, it's important to remember this was all spelled out by Trump long in advance. Throughout the election campaign, he told America repeatedly that he would reshape the federal government, root out and even prosecute his enemies, pardon supporters who were convicted of violent crimes, slash government spending programs en masse, and axe huge numbers of federal jobs." And then he won 77 million votes to do exactly that. Those accusing Trump of being anti-democratic might note that this is largely democracy in action. Sort of an unusual both sides argument there from Politico. But on the one hand, this is a revolution, and on the other, it is a revolution with democratic mandate. That's sort of the argument being advanced. My friend Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum posted on X, quote, "The Trump administration is accomplishing the wish list of the most right-wing serious policy people in a couple of weeks. I legitimately am running out of things I've suggested to general derision in DC establishment land that have not been turned into a Trump EO. He's like the Santa Claus of winning." Inez is one of those serious right-wing policy people who has spent years, actually long predating Donald Trump's entrance into politics, trying to convince Republicans to take many of these steps. She's been involved in all of that. She has a law degree. She testified before Congress. She's also someone who has spent years thinking about the problem of executive overreach and federal government bloat. So I wanted to bring on a serious conservative perspective, and I knew that Inez would be the right person to talk about the revolution. I think both sides agree that this is a revolution. Trump is proud of the revolution, and the left is obviously horrified of it, but everyone agrees that there's a revolution underway here in Washington, D.C. So Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum, where in full disclosure I'm also a senior fellow, is joining us now to talk through some of this. Inez, thank you for being here.
It's great to be here, Emily.
I wanted to ask you about this post from X that you made where you said the Trump administration is accomplishing the wish list of the most right-wing serious policy people in a couple of weeks. I'm legitimately running out of things I've suggested to general derision in DC establishment land that have not been turned into a Trump executive order. He's like the Santa Claus of winning. And that last part is pretty funny. But when you say the wish list, I know if, you were a Beltway journalist, your ears would perk up and you would say, that sounds like Project 2025. And Inez, indeed, there is some crossover, but this is much deeper than that. You say things that you've suggested to general derision in the DC establishment land, but that's going back, I would say, having known you for years before Donald Trump. I mean, some of what he's done, correct me if I'm wrong, seems like they could have been plucked from Tea Party era wish lists.
This is basically, in my opinion, is a list of policy agenda items that the Republican Party has been, in some form or another, promising its voters for decades and never delivering on. The follow-up tweet I sent after this one in a thread was, I'm frankly shocked that we put voting inputs into the system. We voted for Donald Trump. And then the outputs came out of the system and it's everything he said he was going to do and that we voted for. That sounds so basic, but after decades of behaving like a beaten dog with the Republican Party that promises its voters things and never ever delivers on them when they actually have power, this is just incredible. These EOs have been, like I said, just a wish list of serious conservative policy. This is the most prepared, competent, and ruthless right-wing administration for sure in I think the last 100 years, but certainly since Reagan.
To your point about some of the things that have been suggested by, I like the phrase that you use, serious kind of right-wing policy people for years. Which ones stand out to you as somebody who's actually been behind the conception of some of these policy suggestions?
Yeah, there's just so much, honestly. I can't choose, but I'll give you a couple. The batch of EOs that are dealing with the federal workforce, which, by the way, the Federal Employees Union has the honor of being the first to sue the Donald Trump administration. I believe at like 1202 or 1203, they sued the Trump administration. But there's a whole batch of EOs and memos that goes out that show me that they understand what they're dealing with in the bureaucracy this time around. A lot of credit to Russ Vought over at OPM for that. But so resuming Schedule F reforms, which is taking people with policymaking power in the federal bureaucracy and making sure that they are fireable and hireable by the elected president rather than protected by very, very intense civil service protections, right? And this is a basic tenet, you would think, of a democratic system at all. The people making policy-making decisions, people functionally making law in the way that our unconstitutional government has operated for quite some time, right? Regulations have the force of law. Much of the business of the US government goes through the executive bureaucracy. It's not being legislated by Congress. And the people who make the decisions about those regulations should be accountable to the American people, right? In other words, there should be a direct line of accountability to, in this case, Donald Trump, but could be any president, right? The president who was elected by the American people, who then hires a guy who directs the guy under him, who directs the guy under him, who directs the guy under him. Like, that's how this should function constitutionally. What's actually happened is that line of accountability has been cut for decades, where we have millions of unaccountable bureaucrats who are applying their own political acumen and decision making without ever having to stand for election, without ever having to stand before the American people and say, this is the policy that I stand for. Do you want this or not? Show me with your vote. That hasn't happened. And so they're used to this kind of unaccountable form of governance where they get to impose their political preferences on the American public without having to go through the political system. And so there's a series of these EOs. Schedule F reforms are one of them. But there are others dealing with various aspects of the federal bureaucracy. Not all of these are amenable to executive power. There are things that are wrong with federal employment that cannot be undone or done with an EO. But the way that these EOs are designed is incredibly hopeful to me. And I'll just point to a Reddit post that went viral on X with this kind of quote unquote whistleblower making a throwaway account at OPM saying they've taken over OPM. They've taken over OPM in 5 days. They found somebody. They went around a lot of the high-ranking not political appointees exactly, the career bureaucrats there that have those civil service protections until they could find somebody who would work with them. This is a very different administration that came in 2017 that did not know how to use the federal bureaucracy, that allowed that federal bureaucracy to be weaponized not only against them, but against the American, like random Americans who agreed with them. I'm thinking here, for example, about DOJ abuses, that memo that went around that called parents domestic terrorists for showing up at school board meetings. It just goes on and on and on. But this is an administration that from these EOs really, really understands what comprises the deep state, what comprises the bureaucratic state that has functionally run America now for decades, and has a plan to counteract that and to bring it back under political control, back under democratic control. And I think that that's just one among many. I mean, there is so much in these EOs. We could talk just hours about what's in them. And that's the half of them I've read. There's like 200 of them.
It's truly like astounding if you're scrolling through the White House website and just looking at what's happened over the course of the last week. Even Politico Playbook has been referring to this as a, quote, revolution in recent days. But let me ask you about something you just mentioned, which is this is sort of how the government has functioned over the course of the last several decades. So to a lot of normal people who hate what you just referenced, that threat of domestic terrorism coming from people at parent-teacher association meetings and all of that came out of Merrick Garland's FBI, they would hate that. But maybe then they see that, for example, the Medicaid portals right now are frozen because people were confused about the OMB memo that came out on Monday night. And they might say, whoa, wait a second. Are we just like dismantling good things with the bad? What would your answer to that be, Inez?
So I think this freeze is fantastic. It's one of many fantastic. It just seems like every day I wake up and it's Christmas from winning Santa Claus, Donald Trump. This is something I would not have even contemplated, but I think it's a fantastic idea. Several facts about this pause. Okay, one, it's not supposed to apply to individual payments. Now, Medicaid reimbursements, I think, go through various institutions and they go through the states, which is why there's some, sort of unclearness that needs to be resolved around that. But I suspect that will happen very quickly, and they'll resolve in favor of granting these Medicaid payments, right? So this is a pause. It's a temporary pause. They're looking, I think the date that they're looking at is something around February 10th. So we're really only talking about a couple of weeks. And what are they going to do during that pause? They're going to be reviewing all of these grants that have been going out, and they're going to be reviewing them and seeing whether or not the Trump administration wants those grants to continue. And the reason that this is so incredible is because the entire leftist organizational apparatus has been funded by the US taxpayer. These grants that go out, for example, to Harvard University to study, I don't know, the effects of systemic racism on left-handed lesbians, okay? Those are the kind of grants that have been going out for years. They fund, left-wing organizations, nonprofit organizations through grants. They fund basically the entire apparatus of sort of the left-wing activist realm is not funded primarily by private money and donors the way that the rights is. That this is basically like 1,000 heritage foundations being funded every year by the federal government directly. So those are the sorts of things that the Trump administration is looking for. They're pulling things that use language associated with DEI. If you have some kind of grant that's for cancer research in a university, your money will flow back to you in a couple weeks. So they're just taking this pause to actually review where this money is being spent. And there's some really interesting, in my opinion, like constitutional questions that they're very revealing, that shows how far the regular operations of our government have gotten from the original design, the constitutional design of American governance. That I actually think this is a move that will hopefully restore constitutional norms in a way that I don't think we've seen again in decades, maybe in a century, because the reason Donald Trump can do this with these grants, and people might be asking at home, like, since when does the president decide where these dollars are spent? Isn't that Congress's job? Isn't that why they fight about the budget every year? Yes, but most of that budget is written in phrases. The most popular phrase in the federal government in terms of legislation is "the department shall ... Right. So much of the specifics of these grants are left to the agencies, to these unelected bureaucrats. And for so long, the Democrats have just been able to pass off political responsibility that would come with actually legislating in favor of spending taxpayer money on these things. They've just been able to pass it off to their buddies in the administrative state who don't have to stand for election. And those people have written out those grants that, if, held up to the light of day, would be extremely unpopular.
There's so many random ways that the money is spent, and to your point, it all ends up falling under the executive branch. So let me also ask about what you just said in terms of people looking at this and being like, well, he's just governing by pen, and this is what conservatives, and I would say rightfully, criticize Barack Obama for doing on things like immigration, DACA, for example. Have you seen any of that out of the Trump administration to the degree that would concern you yet? Is that something that people should be paying attention to? Does it sort of echo what conservatives were upset with when it came to Obama, or is it, I guess, so far so good from your perspective?
So this is how the federal government has operated now for decades. It has been by the pen and the phone. Obama made it very explicit. And one of the reasons that, quote, blew up and the reason there was such a fight, that was over DACA, over the granting temporary status to people children illegally in the United States, right? That was something that Congress had directly considered and rejected. And so Congress Congress debated about something exactly like this, right? It didn't pass. And then the president went around Congress and said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And so, yes, if this spurs a conversation about the fact that the legislative branch doesn't legislate, I think that's a good thing. Again, I think this is excellent, this pause. If Congress has a problem with the way that Donald Trump is spending all this quote unquote department shall money, they can get off of their collective asses and legislate. They have that power. They just haven't wanted to take accountability for how this money has been spent. It's very convenient for them. They get to say they oppose what the department did if it's unpopular, right? They don't have to take any credit, but they also, don't have to actually legislate and choose what they stand for before their voters in a way that the American people can actually hold them responsible for. It's very politically convenient for them. And again, I would welcome that. If this spurs Congress to actually behave like a co-equal branch of government and, the design of the founders really the first among co-equals branch of government. They are supposed to be doing a lot of this. They haven't done it, again, for decades because they wanted to avoid accountability for it. And Donald Trump is simply taking the executive branch back under his political control, which is ultimately how that branch is supposed to operate. And if they don't like what he's doing, they can pass a law about it.
Did you see the birthright citizenship move saying we interpret the 14th Amendment thusly to be overstep? It kind of reminded me of what Biden did on his way out with the quote-unquote 28th Amendment and the Equal Rights Amendment, which we don't have to get into because you and I could talk for days probably without food or water about the Equal Rights Amendment. But did you see it? Like, was there any executive overreach that sort of like perked your ears when it came to what he decided to do there? I know it's something that's floated around like Claremont Institute circles for a really long time. To me, it seems like there's an argument to be made that that's executive overreach, but I'm curious what you make of it. You're a closer observer than I am.
I think my reading, and I don't have any sort of insider information to report, but my reading of this EO and sort of knowing the debates around this for the last several years, my impression is that this EO is written to place a bunch of sequential questions in front of the Supreme Court. Right. So I think part of the reason, for example, those in a legal status but temporary status here are included in this EO. I think the Trump administration wants each of those categories to get a hearing in front of the Supreme Court and to find out where this line actually is. So most of this goes back to a case, as many people know, called Wong Kim Ark in the late 19th century. But that dealt with people who were temporarily but legally in the United States and the status of their children who were born here. There's never been like an explicit, there's a footnote that hints to it, but there's never actually been a case on point on the question of whether people who are illegally in the United States, their children ought to have birthright citizenship and be granted American citizenship by virtue of being born here. So there is a very open question about what subject to the jurisdiction actually means. Now, maybe the Supreme Court will clarify it and say, yes, that the children of even the children of illegal immigrants are subject to our jurisdiction. That's our original reading of this. I think it is a genuinely open debate. There are some legislative history sort of points that can be marshaled in the Trump administration's favor. Their brief on this was very good and convincing on several points. But ultimately, my impression is that this EO covers so many categories of people so that we can get all of those categories of people in front of the Supreme Court and hash out to whom does birthright citizenship apply. And my own personal sort of feelings on the matter are that the line, and I don't know exactly how this lines up with each particular visa category, but I think birthright citizenship should fundamentally be extended to the children of people who have been invited to be part of the American body politic, right? I don't think that essentially new citizens should be forced on the American people. This should be, I think it's a reasonable conclusion that if we invite somebody to be part of our country, to be a fellow citizen at some point along the line, right, that their children and their families, we assume that when we invite you, that your children will grow up to be Americans, right? That is a beautiful thing. And I am very much in favor of, by the way, of the general policy of birthright citizenship, as opposed to the kind of citizenship by blood that is traditionally practiced in Europe. This is a new world versus old world thing. Latin American countries are also mostly jus soli. They're mostly like the United States. They have the equivalent of birthright citizenship. So I like the system of birthright citizenship, but I think it's a very open question whether that system has been abused by people who are illegally here in the country and have never been, under any circumstances or any interpretation, invited to be part of the American project by the American people. And then also the question of like people who are essentially birth tourism, right? People who are very temporarily here in the United States, also not invited to be, part of the American project alongside American citizens. But we're talking about people who specifically schedule like even as much as tourism visas so that they can give birth in the United States and that their children therefore have American citizenship. So for example, there's quite a large Chinese birth tourism industry because it's very helpful for people to have children with American citizenship. And of course, because we have chain migration, once you have, that's why they call it anchor baby, right? Once you have an American citizen child, then you have granted a series of preferential status to come and be here legally yourself. I think that system has been abused, and I will interested in seeing, I don't really see it as executive overreach so much as I think they want clarification on what the limits of birthright citizenship or constitutionally from the Supreme Court? What are the parameters that are actually set by the 14th Amendment and by the history of the 14th Amendment? And, what can we decide on as elected, an elected government?
Now, Christopher Caldwell wrote in the Free Press, actually just yesterday, quote, 10 presidents managed to insulate affirmative action from public accountability. Then it became obvious to the public that changing anything would require dismantling everything. And Christopher Caldwell obviously wrote a fascinating book on this exact subject. It's something that you, Chris Rufo, and others have now spent years trying to sort of untangle what it would mean, or trying to figure out what it would mean to untangle the civil rights, good and bad, from the bureaucracy. And I'm curious, Inez, of what you make of Caldwell's, assertion there, or maybe the best way to put it is assessment of what's happened just in the first week when it comes to DEI and the sort of civil rights order that's been in place for decades now, and your own take on it, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think these DEI orders have been fantastic. I know that that's a theme, and I have not always been like a pure cheerleader of Donald Trump, especially in his first administration, largely because some of these things didn't happen. But I think these orders are very encouraging, given the way that they're looking at the Civil Rights Act. And here's the bottom line. We either are going to have a major piece of federal legislation that protects the rights of Americans not to be discriminated against on the basis of race and sex, or we're not. And what's totally untenable, and what has been the situation for the last several decades, has been that some races are protected by anti-discrimination law that's in the Civil Rights Act, and some races functionally are not, even though that's not what the law says, right? And I can give you a bunch of examples of that, but I can start with the fact that the EEOC, dealing with Title VII, which is the part of the Civil Rights Act that deals with private employers, they ignore cases that should be slam dunk, like obvious cases. So in 2020, a whole bunch of American businesses came out and functionally said, we're going to use quotas. We're going to hire more people of certain races in the next year. We're going to hire 30% more of people of certain races in the next year. So let me remind people, this, not even a little bit, not even a thumb on the scale, is allowed under Title VII. So there was for many years this special carve out until the recent SFFA decision on college admissions. There was a carve out for universities for affirmative action, but employers have never been allowed to engage in quote unquote affirmative action. Okay. It is illegal for them to consider race at all in hiring and firing. And we had major American companies coming out in 2020 proudly declaring that they were breaking the law. It would be the easiest slam dunk case under Title VII ever. But interestingly, quote unquote, the EEOC did not pick up any of those cases. It did not bring a case against Google for openly declaring that they were going to use racially discriminatory hiring against white people. Right. So what is not functional is for us to maintain these laws and only apply them to certain races. Either we're going to have libertarian free for all where everybody can decide who they want to work with and who they want to hire, and even on the basis of race, and we're going to permit that, or we're going to have the civil rights law that applies equally to everyone, because this half and half thing is completely untenable and it's unfair. And I think the American people have rejected it, not just in this recent election, but just consistently over and over and over again. Every time they have a chance to vote on this question, the American people are overwhelmingly in favor of merit-based hiring and it being forbidden to use race and sex in hiring. So even in California, there was a proposition that was very well funded, attempting to roll back previous protections that prevented universities from admitting on the basis of race. And even in California, okay, that proposition lost by, I don't remember what it was, 10, 12%. It lost by a large margin, even in very liberal states. So even moderates, most Democrats are not in favor of this kind of preferential and discriminatory hiring, admissions, promotion, firing. All of those things need to be done on the basis of merit.
And just in a kind of cultural sense, before I let you go, it's sort of, I think, benefiting Donald Trump that he looks robust and sort of vital, juxtaposed immediately with a predecessor who couldn't really even talk to the press, who, was caught sleeping at meetings and all of those sorts of things that, if you're an average observer, an average news consumer in the country, you're not super invested in it. It makes it look like Donald Trump is just out here getting stuff done. And there's some nuance to that. But I wanted to ask Inez if there's a way in which I was thinking, today, like just seeing local charities around the country start figuring out like, oh my gosh, we might lose our federal grants. A lot of them aren't going to. So putting the panic aside, is there a way in which this feeling of revolution that has swept DC, there was the hilarious New York Magazine cover, they cropped out the black Trump supporters who were at this like very posh inaugural event. Could those vibes be stepped on if people around the country start feeling that they are being targeted or that they are losing certain things from OMB through grants or anything like that? Does Trump risk that just on a political level, even though some of the panic I think is completely overblown and the media isn't doing the best job right now? Is that a risk? Are the vibes at risk here?
I don't think vibes respond very much to policy, but I will say that, frankly, I think that Donald Trump has the opportunity to solidify his popularity because actually most of these things are incredibly common sense. Even that freeze that you're talking about, right? We're talking about a couple-week pause on federal outlays in order to prevent money from going to things that are extremely unpopular, right? If you ask the average American, do you think that the federal government should be funding essentially these leftist activist immigration, organizations that are actively helping, people break US law? Do you think we should be sending grants to them? Or do you think we should be sending, frankly, from the class perspective, do you think we should be sending billions of dollars every year to the Ivy League? Do you think that they're short on money somehow, that the average American taxpayer should be paying billions and billions of dollars to Harvard and Columbia and Yale? I think these are arguments we can win. I actually think most of this is extremely common sense when it comes down to it. And a lot of these issues are 70-30 or 80-20. We haven't even touched the EOs about the definition of sex, right? Just purely defining biological sex in the law where it says sex. Now we mean man and woman. We don't mean gender identity. Because if you want to do that, again, Congress attempted to do that. It failed. It's called the Equality Act. I think it's very misnamed, but it failed because the elected representatives did not want to stand before the American people and pass that. So instead, the administration went around that and redefined sex in the law. Okay, Donald Trump has undone that. So I think these are eminently defensible moves. I don't think they're actually radical. What makes them seem radical is that we have gotten used to incredibly calcified sort of institutional agreement between the two parties. If anything is revolutionary about this, it's breaking through a consensus that I think is frankly unpopular on the left, unpopular on the right, largely unpopular in the middle. It's a consensus that's failed to deliver basic competency and common sense to the American people now for decades, and it's the source of a lot of the mistrust in our society. Those endlessly spiraling numbers about whether people trust the media, whether they trust their government, whether they trust all these different institutions, right? So I don't think these things are radical from the perspective of the average American. Where they are radical and where they do seem like a revolution, and in some way really are a revolution, is within the hallways of power, within those, inside the beltway, quote unquote, right? Between those two establishments of the political parties. That's where these ideas are radical or out of the box or revolutionary. When you actually go to the American people, I think we'll get broad agreement on at least 90% of this.
Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum, thank you so much for your time today. This was fascinating.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. Obviously, I agree with a lot, if not most, of what Inez just said. I do think that many of us have been conditioned to accept the status quo. And the status quo, if we all were able to sit down and study exactly how extra constitutional a lot of the federal government has become, we would reject it. And we've been conditioned to accept bureaucrats running around Congress. Even members of Congress have been conditioned to accept that. If you talk to them, especially on the right, you'll hear them say, actually, we couldn't pass a bill on this if we wanted to. So it's wrong that the bureaucrats just get to say, okay, we're doing it. And sometimes that rankles the left too. If there are people from the energy industry who suddenly start working at the Environmental Protection Agency, which is something that really happens, and start ruling with their pens, it's something that actually can really cross both sides of the aisle. It tends to happen more to the right because if you look at studies, the bureaucracy is significantly tilted to the left. Just personnel is significantly tilted to the left, but it can cut in the direction that people don't like either, especially towards industry. If you're somebody on the left looking at, let's say, the FDA, somewhere like the NIH or the EPA, these are all very good examples of it. And we just sort of get conditioned to the status quo. A lot of journalists are based here in DC. Their kids' soccer teams are members of, the other parents are members of the bureaucracy, and it just sort of becomes the reality. Like, this is how things work. And what Donald Trump is saying is they're not working well, and so we're going to stop it. And obviously the left is going to freak out because a lot of left programs are on the line. And I totally understand, if you're an ideological defender of some of these programs, maybe it's a DEI program, that this is going to be dramatically bad for your ideology. And I would add to that, I think Donald Trump probably is, like, the birthright citizenship thing, I don't think is a grave abuse on the scale of what Barack Obama did with DACA, as Inez mentioned. But I don't think the right should be conditioned to expanding the scope of the executive branch, or particularly of the executive himself, because Donald Trump is undoing through executive capacity a lot of things that nobody likes. It's like, saying we're just going to, abuse the executive power to get back to the baseline. I don't think that's the argument Inez was making, but I didn't like the birthright citizenship proclamation is essentially what it was, even though I understand that they're trying to kind of get this to the court, shift the Overton window, and all of that. So anyway, we're going to be here covering all of this because, obviously as somebody who's on the right, but also in media, I don't really care who I upset. If I'm upset with something, I'm going to say it, and that's what we do here. So please stay tuned for more conversations with people on the right and the left. If you want to become a member of the Undercurrents community, undercurrents.tv, it's just $1 for your first month. You can see what we're all about. You can, ask me some questions. We have an email address that you can find when you sign up, and we'll talk back and forth through some of these thorny issues in the days and weeks to come. Subscribe here on the YouTube channel and wherever you download your podcasts. We will be back here soon with more. Thank you for tuning in.